Psychoanalysis in Indian tradition. We will start this series today, and we will start this with Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and then enter into other texts of the Indian tradition. First, spiritual, then we'll take a look at texts which are dealing with mythology, then with aesthetics, then, if time permits, literature, and we'll try to see how we can do analysis which at times is comparative, at times goes parallel, at times goes divergent, at times enriches each other, at times cancels each other. How we can do that analysis from a vantage point of psychoanalysis, engaging with Indian tradition. Let's go into it today. Psychoanalysis in Indian tradition. The two spaces we are trying to enter into come from very different civilizational perspectives, very different periods in human history. Psychoanalysis comes from the West, by and large rooted on the foundation of materialism and hedonism. In fact, three: materialism, hedonism, individualism. In fact, you can also say partly agnosticism, because in one sense, psychoanalysis does share with existentialism an accepted incapability when it comes to the purpose of existence. And both existentialism and psychoanalysis emphasize on finding one's own idea of a good life with reference to no authority outside of oneself. The Indian tradition, or really speaking, it is the Hindu tradition, comes from the East based on spiritualism, best part of which was created hundreds of years ago, in fact, thousands of years ago. Contrary to psychoanalysis, the Indian tradition or the Hindu tradition incorporates within its fold both the theistic traditions and the atheistic traditions. It incorporates austerity as well as hedonism, incorporates knowing oneself purely by reflection to the other end of the continuum, not going into knowing per se, but going into other approaches like Hatha Yoga or Pranayam or psychedelics in order to know oneself. So psychoanalysis is in that sense very monochromatic. The Hindu tradition in that sense is like a supermart, a Walmart of psychophilosophical and spiritual area. Anything you want, you can find within that Walmart of Hinduism from a spiritual standpoint. When we look at these two spaces we are trying to reflect upon, there are some paradigmatic differences between the two. There is a difference of paradigms. And these foundational differences, unless we clear it out in the beginning, will lead to unnecessary argumentation in the middle of discourse. The first is the view of reality. The view of reality is very different in psychoanalysis and in the Indian tradition. Psychoanalysis essentially is based on materialism. The Indian tradition has a very different view of reality. It looks at universe as composed of 5 different zones. The zone of matter, energy and force, the zone of life energy, the zone of emotions, the zone of thoughts, and the zone of karma and the zone of pure consciousness. And the soul takes a small part from each of these 5 zones to create the human integer. And this idea about the constitution of the human integer, which is linked to the constitution of reality, is very different from the idea of reality and the human integer that the Western rational tradition has. And that tradition is the tradition of psychoanalysis also, which is the tradition of materialism and in some cases evolutionism, but mostly materialism. Second element, yeah. So because of the first two parts, this leads us to this first difference, that when we look at any human phenomena, the occurrence of that phenomena inside the human integer is seen very differently by psychoanalysis and by the Indian tradition. Say for example, take the instance of a childhood traumatic experience. From a psychoanalytic standpoint, that experience is related somewhere to the nervous system. We may not go that far, but essentially related to the psychic apparatus, to use a language of psychoanalysis. Whereas in the Indian tradition, the event would be looked at as having occurred in one of the 5 bodies with extensions into other 4 bodies. And therefore, when it comes to healing, in psychoanalysis, we rely upon insight, making the unconscious conscious, and catharsis. And through catharsis, a fundamental restructuring. It's not necessary restructuring should happen only by catharsis, but usually that is the case. Many times, restructuring can happen also by knowing the path of cognitive therapy. Second paradigmatic difference is related to the purpose of reality. Psychoanalysis keeps a safe distance from the idea of a prescriptive purpose. The Indian tradition is very clear about the purpose of human life and the purpose of reality. So there are two broad, psychoanalysis just keeps away on these two questions. These are questions that belong proper to philosophy rather than to psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis keeps away from philosophy. And in psychoanalysis, we leave it to the person to have his own individual ideas about the two. And we don't take any stand in favor of or against what the person believes in, because this is essentially is philosophy, not really psychoanalysis. Unless these views are completely pathological, psychoanalysis does not get into these two areas. But the Indian tradition is very clear on these two areas. There are two broad approaches in the Indian tradition. The first approach says that there is no purpose of reality. It's a cyclical reality where creation, its journey and dissolution keep happening in a cycle. So there is no purpose of reality per se, and the human integer has only one purpose, that is to be free from this compulsion of rebirth, which comes because of the karmic accumulation. So the whole human purpose then is liberation. This is one school, which is called, in the Indian tradition, we have broadly two schools, the school of yes and the school of no. The school of no does not believe, and these are yes, the school of yes and school of no, it is a phrase very well coined by Osho. It's not my phrase. So the school of yes, the school of no does not believe the reality has any purpose or human life has any purpose other than liberation. Whereas the school of yes believes that the reality has a purpose, not an eternal purpose, but a temporal purpose. That it evolves to a perfect state. So that evolution into a perfect state is its purpose. It remains in a long time in that perfect state, and then the dissolution takes place. Similarly, the human integer also has a choice of choosing between liberation and transformation, and one can, even after attaining liberation, one can choose to participate in transformation and participate and take the position of the school of yes and participate in affairs of the world, involvement with the world. So these two are the two answers that are in Indian tradition, and the spiritual practices of any school, the philosophical beliefs of any school, and the psychological techniques which are used in any school are based essentially on the foundation of answers to these two questions. So based upon what is the answer to these two questions, you develop a path of practice and you develop techniques of practice and you develop a philosophy of the school. So you will have schools of yes, which involve the Vedic school, the Yogic school, the Tantra school, and the school of no, which involve the Buddhist school, the Jain school, and some of the, I'm forgetting the name. It's a school of extreme sannyasa. I'm forgetting the name of. I get it. So it's very important when we do the reflection upon psychoanalysis Indian tradition, which Indian tradition are we picking up, which is the school we are talking about, and what is the position of that school on these 2 points. Because the philosophy of the school, the path of the school, and the techniques on the path, they will be functions of what you believe on these 2 points. There is also a paradigmatic difference on the limits of human potential. Psychoanalysis is very conservative when it comes to the limits of human potential. Within the Western tradition itself, if we go to parapsychology, if we go to human potential movement, if we go to positive psychology, the limits of human potential are far wider and liberal compared to the limits of human potential as we see them in psychoanalysis. Very conservative in psychoanalysis. The limits of human potential are very liberal, expansive, very positive in the Indian tradition. For example, the goal in the Indian tradition is to be in a state of no thought, completely free from all the pulls of pleasure, pain, and fear. In psychoanalysis, we don't believe anybody can reach such a stage. At best, you can have it as an ideal, but in fact, we don't even have that as an ideal. But in psychoanalysis, we don't believe such a state is possible. Whereas this is the goal state of all the Indian schools. Psychoanalysis also in terms of the path and the technique. Yeah, now this is something which has some more words on this. I think this conservativeness on the limits of human potential in psychoanalysis also flows from the limits of psychoanalysts themselves, because they have themselves not experienced a state of no thought. They believe state of no thought is not possible. So when we talk of rare experiences, and when leading psychoanalysts did not have that rare experience themselves, their limitation becomes the limitations of psychoanalysis and the limit of human potential as psychoanalysis sees it. Next point of difference is the point of sadhana, or the technique, or the journey, or the path. In psychoanalysis, the whole idea is reflecting, not acting. That is the essential path. And this reflecting involves both cognitive processes and catharsis, the emotional catharsis. But it does not go into living it out in the world with anybody or even alone. It happens within the therapy room. We broaden our discussion to Western psychotherapy, then some therapies do use self-work as a tool for self-exploration and change, but it is nowhere near to the type of tools and techniques which are employed in the Indian tradition. So the sadhana here, the basket of techniques and tools employed, is a much larger basket compared to psychoanalysis. So here, Indian tradition deploys idol worship, idol therapy rather, use of mantra, visualization, psychedelics, certain forms of dreaming and dream analysis, yoga, asanas, rituals. All of these are deployed apart from self-observation, self-study. So the basket of tools applied are far different, and the whole basket is much bigger and far more liberal compared to that in psychoanalysis. The goals are different. The goal in psychoanalysis, as Freud said, is to make unbearable unhappiness into a bearable unhappiness. Or as Lacan would say, you get into the state where you know what is wrong, you may not be able to correct it completely. Exhaust the symptom of its meaning. And once the symptom in its unconscious anchors is exhausted of its meaning, because the whole meaning is articulated out in the conscious. Or as Jung would say, the goal of individuation. So Jung comes the nearest, or I would say the least far from the Indian tradition, but he is also far from Indian tradition. So the goals here in the Indian tradition are of freedom from the compulsion of thinking, which cannot come about unless one has substantially worked upon the desire, fear aspects of oneself. One has to work very sincerely upon the attachment and revulsion part of oneself. So the goal is of freedom from desire, from negative effects. And that leads to a state of no thought, also put in different names. Mukti, Nirvana. Shunya, Kaivalya. They are not the same. They do share many parts, but they are not the same. In fact, the goal, you can put it in one word, is enlightenment. But what enlightenment means are many different things to many different schools. And this I have detailed out in a small booklet, Effective Enlightenment. Because there are many experiential stations, many spiritual stations, goalposts, all of which lead to a state of no thought. But apart from no thought and apart from substantial freedom from desire, fear, and negative effects, apart from freedom from compulsions, the psychic compulsions, still there is a panorama of these states, the spiritual stations, the goal stations, the goal posts. This is very different from the goal of psychoanalysis, which is cessation of symptoms and knowing oneself enough to make unbearable unhappiness into a bearable unhappiness. In simple words, it is a substantial healing and enriching of oneself, but nowhere near to the goals that Indian tradition keeps for itself. One way to look at psychoanalysis is that it's very realistic. Second way to look at it is it's very conservative and also limited. Another important element is a pervasive element of sublimation in the Indian tradition, where every aspect of life is sublimated in the service of the goal to know oneself and attain enlightenment. To that goal, everything is sublimated. And there we have to go into Sri Aurobindo's concept of the psychic. Not only the concept, but a discovery of the psychic. This part of our personality, which brings in purity, childlike innocence, and sweetness, and the feeling of always being there. And this psychic sweetness sublimates the psychic purity and sweetness and selflessness, it sublimates not only the arts, which of course it does, but most aspects of the culture and its practices. So Indian tradition has this very important element of taking the insights from the spiritual schools into the cultural area and sublimating all ordinary activities. The Indian culture, rather the Hindu culture, everything is ultimately directed, so designed that it helps in, even if in a minor way, towards the spiritual goal either of liberation or transformation. So all aspects of culture, they are geared towards this and have a distinct flavor, impression, influence of the psyche. Now these two are not found in psychoanalysis. Tries to influence culture but usually falls flat. The micro to macro journey is still something far into the future. We are still not at a point where we can really do a prescriptive contribution to culture, starting from the micro knowledge of psychoanalysis to creating a design of the culture. So these are the characteristics and differences of the two spaces we are trying to reflect upon. Now let us look at what do you mean by the word Indian tradition. Psychoanalysis, we all know what it means. We studied years about it. Let us look at Indian tradition. When we say Indian tradition, The traditional meaning of Indian tradition goes like this. So when you say I will do psychoanalysis in Indian tradition, the traditional understanding would be that you would use psychoanalysis to engage with these texts. The four Vedas, Upanishads, there are many of them, 11 are the main ones, Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutras and Yoga Sutras. So these are supposed to be the representative texts, and if you engage with them, the traditional understanding is you have engaged with the Indian tradition. So when we say psychoanalysis in an Indian tradition, the first understanding most would have would be this, that you are going to use psychoanalysis and engage with this text. But what we will do is we will widen our meaning of the term Indian tradition. Our canvas will include all of this, the four Vedas, Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutra, Yoga Sutras, texts from Tantra, some texts from Buddhist literature, some from the Jain literature, some from yoga literature, some parts of mythology, some pieces of literature, some literature from history, and in general, works in the Indian ancient tradition dealing with the surreal in different ways. This is my area of interest, the surreal. If you want to go in details, there are some videos, some discussions I have put on YouTube. What is the surreal? How is it different from the word fantasy? Why is the surreal so important? So when I say Indian tradition, psychoanalysis Indian tradition, I mean psychoanalysis, you take a vantage point in psychoanalysis and then engage with material texts from all these areas. Obviously, based on availability of time, you have to decide the width and depth of engagement. I'm not sure how much of it I'll be able to cover. I'm starting off with Yoga Sutras. So I'm starting off with this text, Yoga Sutras, and then I will try to go to Brahma Sutras. And it's very important because the Yoga Sutras give the central extract in an essential way about the path to enlightenment. And the Brahma Sutras do a kind of comparative study and an aligning study, a synthesis study of Upanishads. Because read individually, some people can find there are contradictions, oppositions in Upanishads related to each other. But the reconciliation, a synthesis into a higher truth, deeper truth happens in the Brahma Sutras. So we will start with the Yoga Sutras, then go to Brahma Sutras, then to Upanishads, if time permits, Gita and Veda, then each of these texts. So this is almost like, if you do it elaborately, this is almost like a 2-year academic program, but we won't be able to do it that way. So in short time, we have to complete whatever we can. So let me see how it goes. I'll start off with the Yoga Sutras and then see how it goes. So broadly in this area of psychoanalysis and Indian tradition, some people have done work. You can see works of Sudhir Kakkar, Girindra Shekhar Bose. Uh, there are two forgotten works, very rich but forgotten works. One is this, I would recommend everyone to go through this. Psychotherapy East and West, a Unifying Paradigm, written by Swami Ajaya and Roloff Ballantyne. Swami Ajaya, I think, is still around in United States. I saw some of his videos on YouTube. If you can get in touch with him, he would be the best person to explain his book. Very rich. Second book also is by the same two authors, Swami Ajay and Rudolph Valentine, called Yoga and Psychotherapy. This also tries to integrate psychoanalysis with yoga. And by yoga, it's a very wide meaning. And they go by a general five body analysis in yoga. They take that as a basis, the chakras as the basis, and from there integrate the two, the Indian tradition of yoga, chakra, nadis, and five bodies with psychoanalysis. So this is, I think, must be more than 25 years old, very rich, but not adequately read and appreciated and used. I think time has come where both of them will be very rich and priceless sources as we move towards the integration of East and West. Cultural Psychoanalysis in the Hindu Himalayas by Meckel is also, if you're interested, you can go through it. So this, some work has happened, but it's very scarce, not adequate. I think less than quarter of adequate. So we add to it. Psychoanalysis and Indian tradition. So when we go into it, what we will do is we will look at first Indian spirituality, psychoanalysis and Indian spirituality, and then go into psychoanalysis and Indian aesthetics, Indian art, Indian mythology, and so on. We'll start with psychoanalysis and Indian spirituality. So when we talk about tradition and Indian tradition, it's civilizational tradition. The most ancient civilization in the world, unbroken for thousands of years. Estimate ranges from 15,000 to 55,000 years. So when we say Indian tradition, there is a tradition of spirituality, there is a tradition of art, a tradition of science, a tradition of literature, a tradition of culture, a tradition of politics, a tradition of economics. What we will focus upon will be some parts of the Indian tradition which are more to do with the internal world rather than those parts which have to do with the external world. So we won't go much into economics, politics, sciences. We'll confine our focus on spirituality, on philosophy, on aesthetics, mythology, culture. Psychoanalysis is something that is hated and dreaded by many who are in the center of Indian traditions, Indian spirituality. They see psychoanalysis as blasphemous, pathologizing, and incapable of engaging with deeper and higher states of the mind. They also see psychoanalysis as something which is a very negative endeavor, does not give you the sunlight, the color and flavor to live. But we have done this discussion before, psychoanalysis and spirituality, Indian spirituality and psychoanalysis. You can see that discussion on YouTube. And we have seen there that there are parts which are common to both, there are parts which are distinct to each, and there are parts where both of them can enrich each other. So part of this aspect of psychoanalysis and Indian spirituality will again go through in this discussion, uh, not in general sense, but whenever it comes up as we analyze the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So psychoanalysis is seen as something confined to pathology, whereas the Indian tradition is seen as something which is holistic and as comprehension of all the three areas: the abnormal, the normal, and the supernormal. And there is a paradigmatic gulf between Indian spirituality or Indian tradition and psychoanalysis. The Indian tradition is rooted in pluralism. Psychoanalysis is rooted in singularism, like the entire intellectual Western tradition, which is rooted in singularity. And the best and most explicit example of singularity is the Abrahamical thinking, where you say, there is one truth, I know that truth. If you don't agree with me, it is my duty to convert you to my point of truth, regardless of what means I have to employ. And the natural logical conclusion of this approach is going to be a crusade and a zero-sum game of beliefs. Either you exist or I exist. It's an annihilatory approach, not an inclusive approach. It's not a enriching or tolerating approach. It is me or nothing approach. Very narcissistic. So the Indian tradition is rooted in pluralism and positivity. Psychoanalysis, like the entire Western thinking, is rooted in singularity and pessimism. So the tradition of enlightenment, except for a few like Voltaire, is not a very optimistic tradition. It's largely a pessimistic tradition. The Greeks were far more positive than later Europe. In fact, I'm reminded of what Heidegger used to say, right? Talked about the primal wonder at the world that we have forgotten. And he says it astonished and astonished the Greeks alone. And after the Greek civilization, we don't see that primal openness, that primal purity, that primal wonder at the world. The overarching paradigm has drowned that openness and the primal wonder at the world in the European tradition. The journey we will take in this series of psychoanalysis and Indian tradition we'll start with the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Let me see how much time it takes. And then I intend to go after Yoga Sutras into Brahma Sutras, then into Tantra, then into Natya Shastra, and then into the mythology, the Sarya. Let me see how much time it takes. If it takes too much of time, I will not go into all of them. Maybe take up some parts of them or omit a couple of texts altogether. Once into the journey, I know how it turns over. So with this background, let us go and be prepared for the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. This is an area where there is a large following of friends interested in the Indian tradition. They will have many questions, and put that questions to hvindia@gmail.com. I usually don't check up the YouTube comments part. You put the questions to my email if you have any. If I can, I'll answer them. hvindia@gmail.com. Thank you.